Mary and family, what can we say? It's been so long, and he's such an icon. And I think the thing that I'll always remember more than his irascible wit was always that he was always there no matter what was happening, no matter what procedure he had. He was always there, whether we were at Woodward, whether we were at Pebble Beach. He was just always Tony. And even lately going to the Minnesota games, and, I think John Lamb was talking about how they tied Green Bay lately, which is not a loss, by the way. Anyways, we'll miss him dearly, and thank you very much for tonight.
You know, when I think of Tony Swan, I think, like a lot of people in this industry, of an icon, a guy who was in this industry for decades. Everyone knew, everyone respected, everyone understood that this guy was one of those kind of pillars of the community, and he knew everything that was going on all the time. He had this wide-ranging background that made him very knowledgeable and expert, and you looked at his pedigree on where he'd worked and what he'd done, it was impressive. And after all of that, I have memories in the last couple of years of seeing him on press trips, and I'm holding my big iPhone, and he's got an older phone, and he's like, "Carl, are those things really worth it?" And I start explaining to Tony, "I don't know, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this." 6 months later, I see him at an event, he's got an iPhone, and he's telling me, "You know what, you were right, this had a lot of great," and I think Tony, he could be maybe not the most flexible person looking for the next thing and all. He might have kind of been a little set in his ways, but he was also this intelligent guy. And if you gave him an argument, he'd take it in and he'd move forward. And he clearly saw the benefit of the smartphones and jumped on once I started telling him why I had one. So just a great guy, of course, always funny and always a joy to be around. He just knew everything and knew everyone. So I think we're all going to miss him, but I think it's great we can be here to talk about him tonight.
This year was actually the first time I've ever gone to the Mama Spring Rally at Road America, and I was really lucky to get to drive there with Tony. It was an amazing trip. We spent the whole day talking as we drove all that way, and I'm glad that I finally managed to do it and actually got to spend the day with Tony doing it. A lot of great stories as always, and I'm really going to miss him.
Okay, well, I had the pleasure, and I would say the terror, of working for Tony Swan at Motor Trend magazine. He salvaged me from Sports Car Graphic, and I got to work with him for about 2 years or so. Kind of imperious, and at the same time a heart of gold. Loved working with the guy, but he could be very demanding. And there was an instance where we were on a ride and drive trip, several of us in Northern California, and we traded cars, and I drove off. And about 10 or 15 minutes later, I said to myself, and I don't know what brought this to mind, pat your pocket, do you have the key to the other car? And it turned out I had keys to 2 cars, one of which Tony was supposed to be driving. So I hightailed it back there. It's about the fastest I ever drove to get back to Tony, who was standing by the side of the road, leaning up against the car with no car keys, fuming. But he was at a slow boil, but he didn't boil over. I was expecting to be fired on the spot, but no, that didn't happen. And I got the chance to work with Tony for another couple of years or so, and then he worked for me, actually, later in his career, so it was nice turnabout. And loved the guy dearly, and I explained to him the vagaries of baseball, and he explained to me the vagaries of motor racing. So that's my remembrance of Tony. Great guy, love him and miss him dearly.
Well, first off, I'm union, so I'm going to have to charge scale for this, which I think Tony would appreciate and subscribe to. Tony, we're going to miss you. You were one of the great characters in my life. From all the time that we spent together at the Chicago Auto Show, every year you would come to the auto show and you would look at my desk and you would say, "That's the best sign in the world," because right in front of my desk was a little sign that said, "No whiners." And Tony said, that's the proper attitude for a press room. So anyway, that's my memory. Tony, I think, is going to be one of those few people in our industry who is hallmarked by his ability to make it even to the grave on someone else's tab. So long, buddy.
Hi, my name is Dominic Infanti, and I'm at Subaru of America. But my favorite story about Tony was when I was with Chrysler. And we had just had our first merger, and we were debuting the Tomahawk, which was the Viper-powered motorcycle. And unlike most PR people, Tony was always nice to me, or at least I felt he was nice to me. Maybe I'm too naive to know the difference. But on this day, he snuck up behind me and we were talking about something as Wolfgang Bernhard came up on the stage. This huge, giant Viper engine motorcycle. He's flipping the throttle. And he's wearing this black leather jacket and a turtleneck and looking, pretty cool. And about 2 feet away from us is Dieter Zetsche, who is our CEO, whom we were all obviously in quite some fear of. And Tony leans into me and says, just too loudly, just to make sure Dieter could hear it, he's like, is it just me, or does that guy look like a U-boat captain? And at that point, I couldn't stop laughing. And I was trying not to let anyone else see me laughing, but my whole body is shaking. Probably like one of my favorite times with Tony. I look back on that story all the time and I just crack up because it was the perfect timing, the perfect setup. Because Tony had that sly, dry sense of humor. But we'll all miss him.
Hi, I'm Frank Cofer, originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I worked for 40 years for the Milwaukee Journal, 10 of them in Milwaukee and 30 of them in Washington, covering mainstream news, civil rights, politics, White House, Congress, Supreme Court. But as a young reporter, I got involved in automobiles. We were a PM newspaper, and nothing to do in the afternoon, so I wrote a couple of car stories. They got me involved in cars. I did it for a while and then had to give it up for a fellowship in the civil rights beat, and then they sent me to Washington. The connection to Tony came because I was a Car and Driver subscriber from issue 1 way back in the early 60s, so I knew his byline, but I didn't meet him until late in life. We bumped, in fact, the first time I introduced myself to him was he was sitting at the bar with Mary in the firehouse at the Detroit Auto Show. And that came into a long friendship. We really bonded on a Mercedes-Benz trip in Spain where I think it was probably typical. Tony hogged most of the driving duties, but I didn't mind because I was in the presence of the great Tony Swan, whose byline I had been reading for years. I have a theory about friends. I have been incredibly fortunate in my life to have best friends at every stage of my life. And there have been many. Some people only have one, some people never have any. But Tony was one of those who came along later in life, and we became best friends, and that's the best way I can describe it. I mean, absolutely terrific guy. I wouldn't be here in NACTOY if it wasn't for him. And my wife and I hosted Tony and Mary at our home in Falls Church, Virginia on the lake a couple of years back, and we have nothing but fond feelings. And I know I'm talking to people who don't know me, but I cannot tell you that I've met a finer man in my life and a greater friend. Thank you.
So the first race that Tony came to of mine, he was out there, it was incredibly hot. It was at Autobahn Country Club. It's about 100 degrees. He went out for about an hour and a half. He was already pretty sick, and he came in completely wiped out. He had heat exhaustion. He could barely get out of the car. I ran over, I got the ambulance. I said, hey, you got to look at this guy. I don't know what's going on. They rolled over and they said, Tony, I think we're okay with you. I don't think you need to go to the hospital, but what we're going to have to do is put you on this gurney and pack your crotch with ice for an hour. Is that okay?
These are doers.
Cheers, Tony.
So we were driving some it was the Veloster, the Hyundai Veloster. Yes. And usually when we go on these drives, especially with pals, it's a struggle, to pay any attention to the directions, and
Or the car.
well, the navigation directions. So, sure enough, we had just had lunch, and we get going, and Tony gets the left out of the driveway correct, and then misses everything after that. I'm like, we're driving on the same road we went on before. That seems weird. And he goes, oh, whoopsie. Like, a block or two from where we turned on, we're supposed to turn left. Okay, I'll turn around.
You were talking about cream puffs, weren't you?
We were talking about cream puffs.
See, I know
Yes,
you
cream puffs and of the culinary and automotive variety as usual, of course. But it was a great time. We both loved the car, and we had just like 10 extra miles of catching up. So That's the greatest kind of mistake.
That's Tony, always catching up.
That's right.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tom McDonald from Mazda. So on behalf of everybody, we'd like to welcome you to this wonderful, wonderful celebration. Just a little bit of background. What started off as a simple dinner that John Lamb and Lauren Fix thought up several months ago as they were planning the North American Car of the Year judging here in Ypsilanti. They said, well, let's have a dinner honoring Tony. Tony was in failing health, and so we got together and we said, that's a great idea. And as we all know, it morphed into a memorial. So we're very happy that we have not just the North American Car of the Year jurors here, but a number of Tony's old friends from the media and from the original equipment manufacturers. And I must say that when I went out to each member company, I asked them would they like to participate, and we have 100% participation from every single manufacturer, every single division of the major manufacturers who are underwriting the cost of this. So a special thanks to my colleagues on the, is that the dark side or the light side? I'm not sure. Am I dark or a light side? The other side, okay. Well, what we like to do is to make this kind of a short presentation, because I'm sure that at your tables there'll be a lot of Tony stories. We all have Tony stories. But what we thought we would do is have a representative from the media, from industry, and from Tony's racing buddies, and then also to hear from Tony's biggest cheerleader and biggest supporter, his wife Mary. You know, those of you that have watched Carrying Bridge for the last probably 2 or 3 years, you can see what an incredible supporter, advocate, and loving wife that Mary was to Tony. The way she wrote about him, I'm sure there were some arguments, Mary, but never, not knowing Tony. But she's quite an incredible woman for what she's been through and what she has done. I would just, before I introduce Mary, Rich Stepos wrote one of the nicest eulogies on caranddriver.com. And if you would permit me to read just a few of the descriptive adjectives that Rich used to describe Tony, and I think we all have a few more of them as well. But Tony was smart, well-read, funny, irascible, cantankerous, correct? Tony was friendly, very opinionated, difficult, charming, honest, scheming. I don't know what that meant, Rich. I got it. You got it, okay. Tough, stubborn, but above all, those of us that knew Tony, he was just one good guy. So I'd like to welcome Mary. Mary, please come up.
That was great. When I'm in front of a microphone, I always have this instinct to sing, but I'll try not to do it. I did it at the Lemons race this weekend. That was enough. I want you to know that I have, excuse me, I've worked with this chef to select some dishes that reflect Tony's personality. So we're starting with a Cactus Appetizer, complete with prickly bits, followed by some salty entrees. That's both literal and metaphorical, for those of you who really know Tony. And we're going to finish with the cream puffs. That's the way that most of us experience Tony. Just because you got through to the cream puffs doesn't mean that you weren't going to go back and have to deal with some cactus. Tony, of course, was a founding member of this group, of NACTOY, And I can prove just how long he's been a juror. And I just realized that I left them over there. But I will imitate what I found in Tony's desk drawer. The NACTOY logo on the slides. You know, the little square things that you put in the projector and that's how old Tony was. He had the NACTOY logo on slides. I also found a box with his NACTOY notes from every year going back to 2001, and I'm sure with a little more time I'll find the rest of them, so if you're interested in creating an archive, I got all the folders. You'll know what he thought about every single car, so this could be valuable. I also want to thank the organizers of the meal, especially John Lamb, whose idea it was, and the officers of NACTOY who liked the idea. But there are two John Lambs here. One is the respected journalist and photographer, and the other one runs 24 Hours of Lemons. So will the real John Lamb please stand up? No, neither of them. They're just pointing at each other. The John of Lemons usually goes by Jay, so that's how we'll distinguish them. I also want to thank the folks who are paying for tonight's dinner. That is the assembled representatives of the auto manufacturers. I always knew that Tony was a master of getting free stuff, and look, he's getting free stuff for us from the great beyond. So thank you, Tony. And thank you, well, you know who you are, the ones with the wimpy wallets. So most eulogies begin by acknowledging only the wonderful qualities of the deceased. Things like generosity, kindness, helping others, selflessness, forgiveness. You know, the qualities that make people human. Well, this isn't a eulogy, and these are not the qualities that immediately come to mind when one thinks of Tony Swan, even me. When I first met him, which was about 1989, I was working on an exhibit about Popular Mechanics for their 90th anniversary, and Tony was their auto editor. So I thought he was interesting. He told great stories. He was a good writer. He knew history. He didn't name drop, but he seemed to know everybody in the automotive world. He had adventures, and he could do a spot-on Minnesota accent for sure, which I could never do. But as I never tired of saying, and Tony never tired of objecting when I said it, I didn't like him all that much when I first met him. He seemed a little too cocky. He was a little too confident, a little too crusty, rather judgmental, slightly vain, and somewhat intolerant of, and when I was writing this, I got to that point and I said, I was struggling to come up with what he was intolerant of because there were so many choices. Was it poor grammar, bad automatic transmissions, ignorant people, misplaced apostrophes, restaurant chefs with so much confidence that they banish salt from the table? In fact, I hope there's salt on the tables. If there's not, we need to get it out here right now. So you can insert your own Tony Swan pet peeve here. So about the second or third time I ran into him, he gave me a friendly hug, but he made sure to flex when I touched his arm. And I rolled my eyes. And I think this captures the essence of our relationship. So I now have a medically untreatable condition called permanent eye roll. And as long as Tony was around, there was no cure. But now I'm in a clinical trial. We're working on full recovery. So you're probably wondering where I'm going with this. I'm like his wife. I'm supposed to be, like the nice one, right? I'm supposed to be the cream puff. So after we first met, I ran into him every once in a while over the next 11 or so years. And then one day, at the very end of 2000, I ran into him at my bar here in Ypsilanti at the Sidetrack. He had not just, but he had moved back to Michigan. I told him that my father had died of kidney cancer just a few days before, and he told me he'd had bladder cancer in 1995. He thought he was going to die. He wrote letters apologizing to various people that he thought he had wronged. He seemed different somehow, and that was when I realized that this old dog might have learned a new trick. So some of you might have contributed to a fund put together by his colleagues to help him pay his medical bills after that first cancer. Tony was freelancing at the time, and he had foregone medical insurance so he could continue to send his daughter to a private boarding school. To the end of his life, he said it was the best thing he ever did for her, and she agreed. So thank you for helping to educate his daughter Hillary, who's now a pharmacist and who was there with me when Tony died. Tony was equally proud of his son Aston, a helicopter pilot and tattoo artist. Great combination, by the way. Scares the hell out of the helicopter passengers. And he was also there for Tony's last weekend and very carefully gave his dad a shave just days before he died. So Tony and I had all kinds of adventures in our 17 years together, thanks in large part to many of the people in this room. We did SCCA and NASA racing, 24 Hours of Lemons racing. Those you can't see it, but I was doing the air quotation marks. Fantastic press trips, car shows, all kinds. We had all kinds of car-branded shirts, jackets, hats, and other stuff. We had rides in cars we could never dream of affording. We had rides in cars we couldn't wait to get out of. And sometimes those were the same cars. You know who you are. Tony came to my band gigs. I introduced him to the behind-the-scenes world of history and technology museums and historic sites. He read my drafts. I read his drafts. His friends became mine, and my friends became his. And one of our friends is behind the video camera, Drake Lawley. Thank you very much. Those of you who were at our party last weekend for Tony might have seen him playing banjo. And if you call banjo a talent, Drake is a multi-talented guy. I don't know if you do, but he also plays guitar and bass, so, you know, we have it covered. More than half the time that Tony and I were together, though, he was wrestling with this damn recurring head and neck cancer. Almost immediately, we started joking about it, partly as a coping mechanism, but also just to let friends and family and colleagues know that it was okay to talk about it directly as we tried to make the best of it. And I realized I printed out the wrong version of this. I printed out the one before I spent the whole afternoon re-editing, so I may go off script here. But Tony never stopped planning. That was one key thing about him. A couple of months ago, he was talking to Brock Yates Jr. about doing One Lap of America again in 2019. He also bought a 2019 calendar, which I'm passing around to get people to sign, so I can keep it as a remembrance. In early September, Tony was also very seriously looking into buying a motorcycle. Yeah, that's the same reaction I had. And I really wish that I had printed out the right version because my new one was so much better than this. But whatever. We're all editors here. After he died, I was checking his email and I discovered that he had signed up Team Scream to race at Sonoma in December. So after I did another eye roll, I contacted the team, we put together a plan, and we're actually going to do it. And of course, you know that Tony ran for NACTOY president earlier this year, even knowing that his doctors had all but run out of options and ideas. I did a big eye roll to that one too, but it wasn't the first time that I'd been gobsmacked by Tony's NACTOY news. And I'm going to try to recreate my edits that I had done earlier. So people have been talking a lot about how Tony really lived while he was dying and how remarkable it was that he just kept on going. Some people have even said that somehow I changed him, like he changed after he met me. But it wasn't me, and it wasn't simply willpower that kept him going. It was practice. He had a strategy. Once he got cancer, he planned his life like he organized for a 24-hour race, of which he did at least 36, not counting lemons, and who would count lemons? So his new strategy came into play immediately after he got his diagnosis. Initially, his cancer was at the base of his tongue. And after they decided to try radiation, hoping to save his tongue, imagine Tony without a tongue, his doctors realized he had some bad teeth. That same afternoon, we had an appointment with an oral surgeon. And the news was pretty terrible. All of his teeth had to come out before he could start radiation, or he might lose his jaw. The radiation needed to start as soon as possible, and his gums had to heal before the radiation could begin. So, you know, you do the math, add the 2, carry the 3. The extractions were scheduled for 8 a.m. the next morning. Even in hindsight, even after all that we went through the next 10 years, that was the single most shocking thing. It was the most unsettling. It was the hardest to handle. It was harder than even him bleeding out in a press car with white leather upholstery. And I have to say that Tony missed his big chance. He'd been crapping on press cars for years, and he finally had a chance to actually bleed out in one. An Infinity, Dan. And we somehow managed to keep all the blood off the seats. So, I was worried about how he would deal with having no teeth, because you know Tony, he always wanted to look sharp. He had pressed shirts, creases in his jeans, polished shoes, nice watches, combed hair. And is Mark Phelan somewhere taking notes? I'm sure he is. Okay. The morning after Tony had all of his teeth yanked out, he was up at 6 a.m. I asked him why he was up so early. With a mouth still full of bloody gauze, he said, "I'm going to work." I said, "I'm sure they don't expect you to come in. Car and driver can get by without you for another day." "I'm going to work." I said, "But the pain meds, you can't drive." "I'm not taking them." "Why?" "Because," he said, "I have to get used to this, and so do they." And that was when I knew he would be okay, and we would be okay. He adapted right away to the new reality, and everything after that was based on his new reality. And he just kept doing that over and over and over. Every new reality, that was just the new normal. It was okay. Then I remember the day that he came home and said he would be announcing the 2010 North American Car and Truck of the Year winners at the Detroit show. This was just a few months after he'd had all of his teeth pulled. And in and of that self, it wouldn't have been noteworthy. He'd done it many times, but he had just finally been fitted for dentures after all of these teeth had been pulled and he'd had radiation to his head. He told me that talking with dentures felt like talking with shoes in your mouth. Well, yeah, it was funny, but he was having a very hard time with it. So, as always, he spent the time before the show planning. He carefully crafted his remarks. The night before the show, I was doing something in the kitchen and I could hear him talking. I thought he was on the phone with Chris Jensen again. It was like, girlfriend, boyfriend, hello. But when I came into the living room, I realized he was sitting there reading his speech out loud over and over and over, trying to enunciate right, trying to make sure that he didn't embarrass himself or the organization or me. And that was where I realized it was a strategy that he had. He was going to plan, he was going to practice, he was going to execute, and he was going to move on to the next thing. And I just want to thank you all for getting used to the new Tony. Some people might say that it was an improved Tony Swan. But I only hope that if this happens to me or any of us here, that we'll be brave enough to get used to it, to find the new normal, to judge things based on the new normal, not by what used to be. That's gone. And Tony always looked out the windshield. He cared deeply about what was going to happen next, and he made the best of it. The only thing I'm sure of is that I will never get used to being without him. I just hope that I can find a new normal. So drive on, Tony, and the rest of you drive fast and take chances.
Tough act to follow, eh? I gotta say, it's kind of weird being here right now. I'm like looking out like I'm in a dream, and I've closed my eyes, and everybody ever knew in this business is in the same place. And if I wake up, maybe you'll go away. But I don't think you will, so I'll carry on. I want to make a point, first of all, that the heavy lifting for this evening was Tom McDonald. I couldn't have done this from California. And I'm here to read the words of Jim McCraw, who was one of Tony's dear pals.
and so I'm just going to read straight from what he wrote. I'm sorry that Hurricane Michael and 2 cases of walking pneumonia between us and Ypsilanti. Sandy and I wanted very much to be there, but we're there in spirit. I knew Tony Swan for 46 years. The first night I met him was at the Chrysler Press Preview Dinner in Ann Arbor in the summer. He was writing for Better Homes and Gardens. We drank a lot and got silly. I knew right then and there that he was going to be my kind of guy. We worked together at the old Peterson building starting in 1973. When he was with Motor Trend, I was editor of Hot Rod. A few years later, Tony was editor of Motor Trend, and I was his executive editor. We partied at his domiciles in Venice Beach, Marina del Rey, and deepest Orange County, and at my apartments and my house in Hollywood. We drank hundreds of bottles of good California red wine together. We shared a few precious bottles of Joseph Swan Vineyards, Cabernet Sauvignon, from his father's vineyard in Santa Rosa. We went to concerts and events and races together. We made fun of the people around us all the time. He was hilarious. He asked me to be the best man at his wedding. Tony was already racing when I met him, and he was very aggressive in everything he did on and off the track. When I asked him once if he jogged on the beach, he said, "No, I run." He didn't just believe in wasting time. When I joined Ford in 1983 and he eventually left Motor Trend, he moved back east and we didn't see each other for some time. Eventually, we both ended up in Michigan, he in Bloomfield Hills at the Free Press and later Car and Driver, and me freelancing in Dearborn. He was an amazingly facile, receptive, entertaining, and award-winning writer. He loved words and he loved making up new ones. We co-drove on dozens of new car introductions and auto show trips in America, Canada, Europe, and Asia. He called me and asked if I wanted to co-drive with him on something called, of all things, One Lap of America. We'd be gone for 10 days. Of course I'd go. We won our class. We did it 3 more times after that and won twice more. That's how good, aggressive, and smooth a driver Tony was, racing for lap times on tracks he'd never even seen before. Later he said he could meet me Later he said we would meet at a Middle Eastern West restaurant in Dearborn because he was there with someone he wanted me to meet. That someone was Mary, to whom I was introduced that very night over lamb chops. She was unquestionably the best thing that ever happened to Tony. I didn't realize it for a long time, but Tony was the older brother I never had. He was responsible for getting me onto the North American Car and Truck of the Year jury in the first week of its existence and on the steering committee. He got me onto pages of Car and Driver, where I contributed for years. He was responsible for having me added to the judging panels at Meadowbrook, St. John's, Boca Raton, and the Orphan Car Show. If there was a freelance opportunity he'd hear about, he'd always call me first. I could not believe that one man had so much fight in him for so long. He fought cancer like the Viking warrior he was for almost 10 years, working, traveling, and racing the whole time, before he finally put down his sword and shield. He was my friend, my buddy, and my pal. I loved him, and I will miss him for the rest of my days. Thank you, from Jim McCraw. And as someone and I were discussing earlier, we kind of think if we just look up every so often, we might see him sitting right up there looking down on us. Throwing spitballs. There you go. Dan Bedore from Nissan.
So, good evening, everyone. I'm seriously honored here to provide my thoughts. Those of other companies and PR people and executives from across the industry as we honor Tony. Mary, on behalf of the PR ranks, thank you for sharing him with us. It really was a blast. So thank you. No, yeah, thank you for that. Well, Kyle Bazemore and Paige, thank you for that as well. So when I heard about Tony's passing, I shared some of my own thoughts on Facebook, which, as everyone knows, is sort of the media of record these days. But the responses were amazing, and I want to say, thankfully, that there are some moments in time when it's important to get together as friends and colleagues, face to face. And I really want to thank the organizers, Lauren, John, Tom, for pulling us together face to face to get together in person and you guys get to drive some cars, so that's super cool. So thank you to the North American Car, Truck, and SUV of the Year jury, the organizers of this event, for this night. Tom called me last week to say that so many people had reached out to say they wanted to say some things about Tony, that it was sort of starting to get unruly, and maybe there was a way to pull it all together. And he asked me if I would represent those of us in the industry, take 5 to 10 minutes to talk about Tony from the perspective of a PR guy. While that's easier said than done, I'm going to give it a try. So I wanted to hear stories when I got this assignment from Tom and John from other people. So I reached out to various PR operations around, from PR people past and present, to gather some fun memories of Tony. And people flooded me with colorful anecdotes, and if you didn't get included in this, it's only because I'm time limited. So there's plenty of great stories. I'm sure you're all sharing them. I may even share a few extra at the table, but among those were Tom's own memories, which include that he's pretty sure that he unwittingly may have had a little something to do with Tony's firing from Motor Trend, which involved a VW GTI, Car of the Year, Tony's editorial integrity, maybe some ad sales guys, an unfulfilled guarantee, and a very unhappy Lee Iacocca. So ask Tom about that story a little later. Yeah, well, there you go. I heard from Bob Austin. Bob came before my time. Bob was the head of Volvo from 1978 to 1991. And Bob's story was super long. It read like a book. It was brilliant. I can't share it all. I'll share it later. I'm happy to send it to you. But that one involves a Sports Renault race car, Steve Harris, Fred Hammond, even a cameo by Sir Jackie Stewart himself, and an epic story that would take way too long to recount, but very brilliant story. And Dave Reuter, who has left our industry but shared a great story, and I saw Don Sherman earlier, about Tony and Don avoiding some cops in, I don't know, suburban Boston in a blue Bentley of some sort, because maybe they were exceeding the local speed restrictions. So that's typical of Tony. There's so many great stories, but probably too many to share in 10 minutes, so I picked a few quick ones. The themes are similar. There are many memories that take place on a track or having to do with Tony getting on a track, which we've all heard before. And there are memories of PR people getting schooled by Tony, which I had a lot of feedback on Facebook about that one. And then there are equally as many that involve his antics at ride and drives, and Don Sherman played a big role in those as well. One really neat insight, and it's something that I shared on Facebook, is Tony is a teacher. I referred in my Facebook post to Tony as sort of a professor to me and teaching me a lot about the business, and that you'll hear that come through. And I really want to just get on with it and share some thoughts from others, not me. So I'm just going to read from some of the stuff that I got from my colleagues. I'll start with Scott Vosen of Toyota, who, ironically, Scott wrote to me and he said, Dan, most of my stories about Tony are him being really feisty and kind of mean to me, and I don't think it's appropriate for this setting. And I said, oh, no, you need to send that to me. Let's talk about that. So here is reading from Scott. Here's my first recollection of Tony's feistiness with me. It's the mid-90s. I emailed Tony the answer to a product question. In my note, I asked if Car and Driver would be interested in attending an upcoming media preview. But in my email, and I wasn't being lazy, nor was my intent to be disrespectful, just trying to be efficient, I referred to Car and Driver as C &D. Yeah. About a minute later, my phone rings and it's Tony. He reads me the riot act. I was disparaging Car and Driver's brand. I should know better the differences between outlets. And the ampersand was used by Road and Track. Do I even know how to read? And on and on. I just listened and I agreed with him. Did I have a choice? I reflected on the conversation after we ended the call, and thought to myself, Tony was right. He taught me a few valuable lessons, which I believe was what his intent was always. It's important to get it right, to be accurate. 2, consider your audience. 3, an email can be easily misconstrued, and companies are made up of people that work hard every day and care about the brand. Lastly, don't be an idiot. I think this was the most valuable point of all, and I'm pretty sure those are the words he used with me. From that day forward, we were fast friends, and I likely had hundreds of similar conversations with Tony following the branding lesson, quotes. But I always enjoyed his give it to you straight honesty and mentoring and sense of honesty and humor. Yes, he had one. So very good from Scott. Thank you, Scott. Next one is from Simon Spruill of Aston Martin. Quick one. My abiding memory of Tony dates back to my first encounter with him when I took over Jaguar PR in the U.S. in 2000. I think it was a Geneva Motor Show, and I was keen to impress Tony with my newly learned knowledge of classic Jaguars. Tony ran in absolute circles around me, talking about cars he had driven that I'd never even heard of. But he did so in a way that was full of passion and humor. Simon spelled that H-U-M-O-U-R, by the way. I took notes that day, including learning about a new product attribute in classic British cars, Lucas, the Prince of Darkness. So those of you who know that story, Google it if you don't. From Tony Servone of General Motors. Tony took me under his wing early in my career and allowed me to make mistakes without crucifying me. He was alone in that, I think. He nudged me along to be more relevant, and eventually it evolved into an easy relationship filled with smiles and laughter. Really going to miss him. Rest in peace. From Tony. Jeremy Barnes, and by the way, if this one chokes me up as I kept practicing it, so forgive me if I get a little misty-eyed on Jeremy Barnes from Mazda's Remembrance. Jeremy said he couldn't remember a single story about Tony, but there were several things he wanted to share. And he just started with strong. Wow, was he ever? Physically. Tony never failed to amaze. I ran a Lemons race with him in Denver in June, and I think Chubba is going to share a little more about that. Despite weighing a little more than 30 pounds, Tony insisted on helping unload the car, fuel it, set up the pit area, and did his full hour and change stint. I don't remember the lap times, but I think Tony was second or third quickest of our drivers. Stubborn. You ever try to tell Tony something you didn't want to hear? How'd that work out for you? Mentor. Tony was always there for me as a PR guy. And when I needed to bounce an idea off a grizzled, knowledgeable journalist, he'd never pull a punch telling me it was a stupid idea, my new car was crap, or the engineers just didn't get it. Fast. To the end, Tony drove too fast on the freeway, poorly suffered idiots dawdling in the fast lane, and shamed plenty of racers many years his junior on the racetrack. Inspiring. Tony stared the horror of cancer in the face and showed it that it had met its match in him. He never shied away from it. He never asked or expected any from anyone. He didn't hide from the limelight. He didn't pretend he was fine. He never questioned himself. He never doubted that it would get him eventually. But he was never going to sit around waiting to die, and never, ever stop loving his wonderful wife, Mary. Here we go. I wouldn't wish Tony's cancers on anyone ever, but if I could, I'd give Tony's incredible attitude on everyone, everywhere who's afflicted. Very nice from Jeremy. Switching pages, Jason Vines. I feel like I should wear like a red hat when I read Jason Vines' comments. Tony was part of the axis of curmudgeons for us, then young PR guys. And by guys, I include women, please. He was joined by Forbes' Jerry Flint and the evil spy photographer Jim Dunn, who is in our presence, ladies and gentlemen. Those three would chew you up and spit you out if you didn't have your stuff together, and they relished in their scary status. However, and this is the beauty of Tony and his compadres, once you proved yourself, and importantly, helped them do their job, and you saw the great hearts these gents had. Tony's heart was as big as a watermelon. He tried to hide it, but he failed miserably. His love for cars and the industry was immeasurable. I think it was a Viper launch in LA. Could have been the LH, so sue me. I was in a car with Tony riding shotgun when I said, yeah, I'm a car guy. I can take a car apart, I just can't put it back together. Tony laughed and said, that's why you work for Chrysler. Sorry, Rick. Again, Jason's words, not mine. We were friends forever since, and as Emeritus Director of the Automotive Hall of Fame, I will send a recommendation for Tony's inclusion in the Hall. That's from Jason Vines. There are more stories like these, surely many more in this room, but I'll close with the thoughts from Mark Royce, shared by Mike Albano and the GM team. Mark is the Executive Vice President from General Motors and a renowned car guy. He provided the following for this gathering, and I think it sums it up. And I'll quote Mark. Tony was a good friend and an amazing man. I grew up on his words, and they shaped my opinion of many, many cars. His stories helped enlighten, entertain, and ensure our industry had a new generation of car enthusiasts. Thank you.
Good evening. I met Tony in the early 80s, and in the 35 or so years that I've known him, I never knew him not to be racing cars. It was an incredible passion of his, and back when I met him in 82 or 83, I was a car and driver, he was at Motor Trend. We were mortal enemies, but we met at Nelson Ledges, and he was racing, I was racing, we got to talking about the racing, and we became great friends ever since. It was part of a great time because this showroom stock endurance racing had gotten going in the 80s, and so a bunch of us journalists got free rides. It was wonderful. We raced like Mario Andretti. We didn't have to pay. We had teams that set up cars for us, and Tony got into it more than anybody else. I kept on running into him at races all the time, and when that series finally ended, that's when you really saw his passion. And passion's an overused word today. It's often applied to people who have a mild interest in something. In Tony's case, passion was totally into racing cars because when those free rides stopped, I tended to stop racing. I was looking for more free rides, but I wasn't willing to spend my money on it. Tony, on the other hand, he was dipping in and spending his money immediately. He gets an SCCA car, he buys a trailer, he buys a van to haul things around. Well, there you go, you know, but he was going and doing it all along. And when he joined us at Car and Driver in the late 80s, he continued to race, and of course the two of us contrived to come up with more free racing. I tended to believe that journalists who raced had maybe greater credibility and better driving ability. I think Tony just wanted a free race. And so we did 4 of the 25 hours of Nelson Ledges races, and we tried to contrive to do any race possible. Well, I left Car and Driver at the end of 2008, and a couple of months later I go into the office and I see Tony, and he's got this big lump on the side of his neck, and that was the start of the cancer. And he starts fighting it, of course, and I saw him the day after he had all of his teeth pulled, and he didn't look like our old Tony. But then later on that year, he finds this clapped out Honda Prelude in Southern California. It's in nice shape, but has something like 260,000 miles on it. And he goes out and retrieves it and says, we're going to do a Lemons car. And again, he spends his own money on setting it up. Ultimately, he sucks some of us in as partners, but the guy wanted to keep racing. And that Lemons car went on. And I honestly believe that in Tony's case, that whole notion of live to race, race to live is what kept on extending his life because he just loved it. And he would not give in. I remember a time a few years ago when we're having a meeting prior to one of the Lemons races, and Tony is talking about the plan, and he always liked to tow the car out to the trailer. He had a particular spot at every track where he wanted to pit. And, you know, I'm not sure it made any goddamn difference, but in Tony's head, it was just critical that he be at that spot. And he's telling us that, yeah, I need to get out there on Thursday, and I've got a radiation treatment Thursday afternoon, but I'll tow the car out on Thursday evening, but then I got to drive back because I got chemo on Friday, and then I'll go out for the race Saturday and Sunday. And I remember looking over at you, Mary, and we're both rolling our eyes. Unbelievable. And I mean, ultimately he gave in on that one, and I think I towed the car out to the track. But that was the attitude that he took to this racing. He was not going to give in because of this cancer. He wanted to go racing, and he wanted to go racing his own way. Jeremy mentioned the race out in Colorado, and I participated in that. This was this last June. It was 100 degrees. It's low humidity in Colorado. There's a wind blowing. I mean, we're dehydrated. And one of the problems with Tony's cancer was because he'd had so much on the sides of his neck, he couldn't really swallow very easily, so he couldn't hydrate himself. When I did my shift, I was fully hydrated when I get in the car. I have a liter water bottle. Halfway through my hour-and-a-half shift, I've already sucked it dry. I mean, it was that kind of conditions. Tony gets into the car. He's probably dehydrated when he gets in the car. He can't suck on a drink tube and can't get any water in the car. He does his shift, and he's got good lap times. And this was in June. I mean, unbelievable, unbelievable. I would have fallen over dead if I'd been that dehydrated. This past weekend, we just did a lemons race in Gingerman, and this was going to be the last race. And, you know, we'd been watching the Carrying Bridge post going up, and I think a lot of us in September had doubts whether Tony would make this race or not. But he was ready to go. He was continuing to plan. It was all set up. Ultimately, he didn't make this race. But, of course, Tony continues to race from the beyond. In August, he had sent me an email saying, you know, there's that last Lemons race at Sonoma, at Sears Point Raceway. He loves that track. We had both raced there in the Corvettes in the 80s. It's a fantastic place. Would you be interested in racing there? And I'm thinking, well, you know, I don't know what the chances of this are, but the guy has continued to extend the timeline, so I'm on board. And I signed up, everybody else signed up, and as it turns out, we're doing the Sonoma race. So Tony is continuing to get us to race from beyond. I'm convinced it added years to his life because that's one of the things he had to live for, and it's one of the things he loved more than anything else. Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Chubba, Dan, and John, and also Jim McCraw. And I see Mary is approaching. She wants to say something else. So
I just forgot to mention that without Tony around, I'm afraid I'm going to lose touch with some of you, so I've put business cards on some of the tables. Some of you already have my contact information, but if you don't, please take a business card or take a picture of one and keep in touch.
Thanks, Mary. We will do that, certainly. Just some housekeeping. We have a buffet set up for tonight rather than, you know, what was the old thing that Paul Eisenstein said, eat free or die? Rather than you all jumping up at one time, our wait person here will take tables at a time, get you through there, and then we have wine service coming out and the bar is open. So again, to all of you, thank you so much for being here, for sharing the stories. We would ask that at the table, tell some Tony stories and maybe circulate a little bit later on and tell some more Tony stories. So thank you very much.